Mine on? Yes, I'm on. Welcome to Hudson Institute. Welcome to this panel on Reconstructing Iraq, Challenges Ahead. I'm Jonas Parello-Plesner, a senior fellow here at Hudson, and your moderator for the event. I'm very excited about sharing this panel surrounded by so much expertise and authority on the subject with Iraqi Ambassador, senior researcher at RAND, Linda Robinson, and Hudson's own Michael Pregent. I'm sure we'll have a great discussion with lots of important insights. On top of Hudson's own live streaming that we always do, we have the honor of having C-SPAN doing this event. So another greeting out to all the viewers out there. Reconstructing Iraq is our theme today. The good news from Iraq is the military defeat of the terrible terrorist organization ISIS by the Iraqi military in collaboration with the international coalition. Yet, the task ahead is as daunting as any military campaign. Now, Iraq needs to rebuild and to heal its communities. Challenges remain, from funding continued stabilization efforts to the even larger resources needed for reconstruction over the coming years. Increased funding was one of the goals of the recent Iraqi Reconstruction Conference in Kuwait, which secured around $30 billion from public and private actors. Significantly there, the Gulf countries stepped in. Kuwait hosted the conference, which is an interesting testimony with its own troubled history with the Iraqi invasion back in 1990. So congratulations to the Kuwaiti for doing this. At the conference, Saudi Arabia also became a new large donor to Iraqi reconstruction. It shows that new sort of regional configurations are at play. But as we said, there are still challenges ahead, which is the title of today's event. Let me mention some that we can return to in the debate. First, continued post-conflict stabilization is still what's needed for Iraqis displaced persons to return to their homes. Over 3 million Iraqis have returned, but more wait in camps or temporary accommodations. Bringing back normal life, removing unexploded bombs and mines, getting electricity and water back is still among the essentials in many areas. Equally important is now reconciliation, both at national level, leading to political accommodation, and at the local level when people return and must rebuild their communities. It's important to underscore how reconstructing Iraq should simultaneously contribute to reconciliation and political accommodation, particularly for Sunni communities. We also want to discuss the US's approach to Iraq, including sort of the novel Trumpian approach to burden sharing. We saw that displayed in the fact that the US did not contribute reconstruction funding at the conference, which was seen as nation building. President Trump wants to build infrastructure at home in the US and tweeted dismissively about the $7 trillion the US has already spent in the Middle East. Instead, the US encouraged other partners to step up, including Saudi Arabia and the private sector. Still, the US maintains a military presence in Iraq with a view to securing that ISIS does not resurface. The question of Iranian influence in Iraq, including through some of the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF, is also a continued topic for US policymakers regarding Iraqi policy. In the Iraqi political debate, the continued presence of US military is increasingly also a heated topic leading up to the Iraqi parliamentary elections in May. Elections where it's not all guaranteed that the current prime minister or body can muster another governing coalition, a theme that our panel will also touch upon. So if you want to read also more about some of these challenges, my colleague Michael Pregent and I, together with our research assistant Kate Go, did a paper on it, which I think was available out at the entrance in paper copy, and it's also on our website. Let me also mention that together with another Hudson colleague, Peter Rao, I have written an op-ed in Defense News on how this Trumpian burden sharing plays out in Iraq. Again, there should be a paper copy available. And for listeners out there, again, look at the webpage, Hudson's webpage. Let me now turn to introducing our speakers. First and foremost, we have the privilege and honor of the Iraqi Ambassador, Fareed Yasseen, on the panel. On top of securing Iraq's important relationship with Washington, and there being Iraq's top diplomat here, Ambassador Yasseen has a very interesting personal background. You were originally trained as a physicist here in the US as well, MIT, right? And later he left science and became involved in human rights advocacy, also in Iraq, and then later joined sort of the Iraqi National Service and held several prestigious positions both home in Baghdad And before joining us in Washington, Yasseen served ambassador to France and speaks French, which we have the pleasure of doing sometimes.
Yep.
So a great pleasure to have you here on the panel. Linda Robinson is a senior international and defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. Linda's research is on the campaign to counter the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and the stabilization which should follow the military campaign. I personally really recommend Linda's RAND report from last year. It's really still pertinent and with the title Making Victory Count After Defeating ISIS, based on really solid field research. Linda has just come back from a recent trip to Iraq and will share some of her observations from that trip with us. And then I have my Hudson colleague, Michael Pregent. Michael is a former intelligence officer with over 28 years of experience on security, terrorism, and counterinsurgency, particularly in the Middle East, where he served in Iraq. Michael had the opportunity to be invited to participate in the Kuwaiti Reconstruction Conference, so he can provide his observations from that experience and more broadly on Iraq's trajectory. So the run of show is the following. Each panelist will now provide their initial thoughts. Then I'll moderate a couple of questions up here on the panel based on these challenges that we've set out. And after that, we'll open it up for questions from all of you. So Ambassador, it's a great pleasure once again to have you join us here at Hudson. We look forward to hearing your remarks.
Well, thank you first for inviting me. And I'm really happy to be on this really interesting panel. Many years ago, I used to be a lowly consultant for RAND, so I'm honored to be sitting next to you this time. It's not easy to talk about Iraq because it's such a complex issue. Many of the dimensions that cover this evolution of state are all interconnected and interconnected also in history. So what I want to do is basically go over at sort of a high altitude of where we stand, and then I'll leave the issues that you want to dig into to the question and answer period. And I say from the outset, nothing is off the table. You can ask whatever you want. So first of all, the Iraq of 2018 is not the Iraq of 2004 or 2003 or certainly 2014. What happened between 2014 and now is really remarkable. It's quasi-miraculous. In 2014, we were at the risk of losing the country. Baghdad was almost taken over. Erbil was within a mortar's blow of ISIS. And were it not for the heroic attitude of our Iraqi counterterrorism service and the appeal of Ayatollah Sistani that called for the Iraqi population to rise up and save the country, I wouldn't be here to talk about where we stand and how we stand ready with the help of the international community to rebuild the country. So what happened is really remarkable. The Iraqi army that has now defeated ISIS is not the Iraqi army of 2014. The governance structure of Iraq is different from what we had in 2014. The political discourse that we have is different from what we had in prior to 2014. One of the interesting things that we'll talk about is our forthcoming elections. One of the interesting things that are worth mentioning in these elections is that the eagerness of people to have cross-sectarian, cross-ethnic coalitions. And in fact, this is a trend that has been consolidating over a period of time. If you recall, in 2010, the electoral list that garnered the greatest number of votes, almost the greatest number of votes, was called the State of Law. Okay, the other one that got was the national list, Wataniya. One of the lists that had a very identity-based name in 2010 changed its name to the List of the Citizen and more than doubled its score. This means that people want this kind of evolution, want governance, want good things to to be implemented by their governors. So why are we in a different situation than we were before? First of all, there is a sense of Iraqi empowerment that did not exist previously. I often heard people tell me that they have a sense of anxiety because we are where we've been before. Military intervention to quell an uprising in 2004, again in 2009, political conditions didn't follow up. We're in the same situation right now, but with the main difference is that in 2004 and 2009, Iraqis were not the ones doing the bulk of the fighting. In 2000 and from 2014 until now, the fighting has been done, and we have the casualties to prove it. It was done almost entirely on the ground by Iraqis, obviously supported very ably by the coalition led by the United States, but nonetheless, the fighting and the dying was done by the Iraqis. Same thing if you look at the conference, the Reconstruction conference that was held in Kuwait just last week. This is not the first Reconstruction conference that we have on Iraq. The first took place in Madrid in October of 2003, and it generated a large number of billions of dollars in support. But the difference between that conference and the one that took place just last week was that in 2003, it was entirely run by the CPA with the help of the United Nations and the World Bank. But the Iraqis who were present, and actually I was not in that conference, had a marginal non-speaking role. Whereas in this conference, the bulk of the work, the bulk of the expectations were based on assessments done by Iraqi entities, the Planning Ministry, the Ministry of Finance, that came up with the numbers, obviously with the help of international organizations like the World Bank and Ernst & Young, to come up with what is needed to rebuild the country. So there is a sense of Iraqi empowerment. And in fact, to go back to the conference, the Kuwaiti conference, that raised a large number of billions of dollars, 30 billion almost. I've heard people criticize it for not containing a lot of money in terms of direct aid. We're not looking for that. Mostly it consisted of loans, but what we're looking for really is something that can empower us to rebuild the country. You mentioned that we had defeated ISIS. It's not enough. I think what the objective that we're trying to achieve is to make sure that the conditions that can lead to a reemergence of ISIS or anything related to it no longer prevail. And this will imply that we will have to make sure that Iraqis, from wherever they are, have a sense of ownership of both the political process and the economic process, and so that they have a share in their country. It's not an easy thing to do, given the backdrop of what we have, but one of the first things that we're trying to bring about to make this happen are elections. And the government is really intent on holding them on time. The date that was set was the 12th of May, barely 3-4 months from now. Again, we're doing things at the very last moment, but I think we'll hold on to the timeline. And that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, the reconstruction. And I would like to go back to an incident I lived through that shows the importance that the Iraqi government attaches to this. When ISIS attacked Iraq, we were left for 3 or 4 months actually standing on our own until the international community came to our help in late August, early September of 2014. And in 2014, the President of France decided to hold a conference in support of Iraq and went to Baghdad and met with the Prime Minister to invite him to attend that conference, actually by the President. And the Prime Minister told him very clearly that ISIS is not the problem, the main problem. We will defeat ISIS. He said, the real problem is rebuilding after ISIS. He gave examples of what ISIS had done. He even mentioned the fact that they had destroyed football fields in the cities they've occupied. And he told the President of France that if you could use that conference to call for the creation of a fund to help the rebuilding of the liberated parts of Iraq. And in fact, sometimes things take longer than what you plan, but this is what the conference in Kuwait brought about. And the final thing that I want to mention about this is that this conference is the first in all the conferences that were held by the World Bank, to my knowledge, in which the private sector played such a key role. And this is something I take actually great pride in because it turns out that people view Iraq as a country that is worth investing in. The cornerstone of what was presented at the conference in Kuwait were something like 15 or 20 projects, major projects throughout the country that were considered to be bankable. Of course, a conference like Kuwait is not an outcome. It is the beginning of a process that we will have to implement. And we are intent on implementing it. And the first step to do that is to spell out the problems that you expect to face in its implementation. And I think there's a consensus amongst the international community and the participants that the Iraqi government did that. Putting the finger on the heavy bureaucracy that we have, sometimes I actually have to struggle with that, and it's don't let me get started. And then a scourge that really is almost often related to terrorism, which is corruption. Recently, there's rankings that were issued by one of those listing organizations where Iraq was 12 ranks from the worst country in terms of perceptions of corruption. I think in reality we're a little better than that, but honestly it is our intention, and the government is taking steps to do that, to move in the right direction so that people can come and invest and find it easy to build in Iraq and discover what we are looking for, which are win-win solutions. The final thing that I want to say, and that's a point I've used in several, when talking to representatives of donor countries, don't think of the money that you're investing in Iraq in terms of foreign aid. It actually could arguably be considered as defense spending, because turning Iraq into helping Iraq return to becoming a stable, prosperous, unified country will only bring stability to the area, prevent the emergence of non-state actors that can target this country or Europe or civilians everywhere. I think we'll get there, but we need the help of the international community, and fortunately, it did deliver. So thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador, for those really insightful and also great personal remarks, and hopeful as well. So that's, I think, a great start for us here at the beginning. And I now turn it over to Linda Robinson, who can both sort of tell us about her last trip to Iraq and also delve more into the question of sort of moving from stabilization that you're really great expert on, and to Reconstruction, and what are some of the conditions that for, as you put it in your report, making victory count after ISIS?
Thank you, Jonas. And I want to thank the Hudson Institute. I think it's extremely important that events like this are being held in Washington, because I think that the tendency is to check the block and say Iraq is done because the military operations are done, and turn the focus away. There's so many competing challenges right now in the world and that are clamoring for U.S. attention. And I have been going to Iraq. I was there at the outset of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and I've spent a total of 3 years on the ground in the country since that, those very first days. I made my 23rd visit in January, as Jonas said. So I'd like to just give you a few quick bullet points about my perception of the current situation, where they are in the path, what are the key things for the international community in the U.S. to focus on. And I'll leave, since Michael was at the Kuwait conference, I'll leave obviously those observations to him.
Oh, you can help me out on those, that's fine.
Thank you. So I would like to say, start with good news. Extraordinary performance by the United Nations Development Program and its leader, who just departed for another hotspot, Yemen, Lise Grande, has been one of the most effective international bureaucrats and diplomats that I've ever met. And this is a small arm of the UN. The USAID and a lot of coalition partners put the money into that organization to implement projects, and I think they should receive some credit for what has been achieved, of course with Iraqis being actual implementers. But I think it's very important to note, and we'll talk more about the stabilization model that has been employed there, because I think there are important lessons for elsewhere, just as the military operations contain incredibly important lessons for future conflicts, because as the ambassador quite rightly said, this was a war fought by Iraqis and with U.S. and coalition support. General Votel, the CENTCOM commander, is used by, with, and through as the bumper sticker for this type of campaign. And I was out there in the field through much of this, and I think that it's a viable model, and it's very important for Iraqi confidence moving forward, and the very considerable Iraqi nationalism that we need to remember is really the hope for the future for many of the difficult things that still have to be worked through. And I've seen both pride by Iraqis in what they've accomplished, and I've also seen acknowledgement of the U.S. help. So I think perceptions of the U.S. in Iraq have also turned around vice some earlier periods in our long engagement there. With regard to the Nineveh province, which we wrote a report, Making Victory Count, and thank you for acknowledging it. We did case studies of stabilization in the Anbar cities, Tikrit, in Salahuddin, but we really focused on Mosul. Partly because it is the second largest city in Iraq and the largest with the Sunni majority, but also because it's a true political symbol. I think as Mosul goes, it's going to be a political bellwether to Iraqis about whether they intend to help that part of the country and the Sunni minority of the country get on its feet and find its place in this Shia majority country. So I think it's rife with lessons. My key visual that I want to bring you from our trip there is how heavily contaminated Mosul is with IEDs, explosive improvised devices. And this is a technical prerequisite for moving forward with a great deal of other stabilization activities. The unmasked UN Mine Action Service personnel estimate that 90% of the public buildings in Mosul have at least one bomb in them. Many of them are just laced with bombs. You've all seen the pictures of West Mosul destroyed. 16 neighborhoods of Mosul have been destroyed. Now, there's a combination. Certainly, ISIS did its work by planting bombs in everything from buildings to baby cribs, but there also is unexploded ordnance dropped by the coalition that represents a very severe hazard, not only because it's unexploded, but those bombs actually cracked the water pipes of the Mosul city system. So they've got some very severe infrastructure damage as the result of the coalition effort to help support the military campaign. Also, one action taken that I think it bears calling out, the US-led coalition also bombed the supergrid of Mosul, of Nineveh province at the outset of the campaign. And that, of course, is critical to bring back online to fully resupply electricity. We talked with the engineers, and they have a very complicated project of restoring all the power stations from the local level out to that supergrid. It's not an easy task. And for those of us there in the early years, we remember with General Petraeus and the power plant of Dora, of Baghdad, these are massive undertakings. And this is why I do think it's critical for the US to continue to have leadership and put some of its enormous wealth into projects that need to happen to enable Iraq to move forward. So I do have some critique about the entire handoff of this to the international community, because we've helped destroy some of these things, and I think we have a moral obligation to help rebuild them. Two other quick points. There are 2.6 million IDPs. They're not all going to return home. Some may find some other homes, but what they can't do is stay in the camps or stay in places where their livelihood is precarious. And these are mostly Sunnis. So this has profound political ramifications for whether these people are taken care of. It's obviously, first and foremost, a government of Iraq responsibility. But we have, again, thanks to the UN and their implementing partners, some very good tracking data. We know where they are, we know the numbers, and we need to keep the focus on that. The other point, it regards security. The number and quality of hold forces is absolutely critical to the success of the stabilization effort. And I'm happy to report one good news from West Mosul. The federal police, which are primarily Shia and which were not welcome, have now been moved out, and the Iraqi army is moving in. And I think it's very important for Iraq to understand that local police are the best way to secure and police the Sunni areas. And that means emphasizing the recruitment of local people. Do not engage in local collective punishment, paint them all with the brush of being ISIS supporters. You need to hire these people back on and train them and put them to work. The Iraqi army has a much better embrace. And of course, the counterterrorism service, Moslawis put up a billboard thanking the counterterrorism service for coming to rescue them. Of course, there's also the very delicate issue of the popular mobilization forces. And those are now enshrined in law as a fourth service, security service of Iraq. But there's a very important and controversial questions that have to be dealt with regarding the degree of Iranian influence, control, and direction there. And we will talk more about that, I'm sure, in the Q&A, but that's something that must be, I think, dealt with to truly stabilize Iraq and help it be both secure but also politically at peace. We'll, I'm sure, talk more about elections, but I think it's very important that as Iraq is moving forward with elections rather than postponing them. I think it's a juncture at which the youth of Iraq are going to come out. We talked to a lot of politicians and the cross-sectarian alliances, and the number one issue is corruption. And the government, I think, has rightly stated that's its number one priority, but tackling corruption will both gain the trust of the Iraqi citizens and bring in the much-needed foreign direct investment. And I hope, and whoever is elected and comes out of that very complex Shia political dynamic there, because it will be a Shia-led, it's Shia majority country, that whether it's Prime Minister Abadi or someone else, if they do not take seriously the need to tackle corruption in a absolutely front and center way, they will lose the confidence of their people and the international community.
Linda, thanks for those comments, also for bringing stabilization to where it's really concrete, removal of mines, reestablishment of electricity, all these things that are really the things that make people able to go back to their homes. Mike, I now turn it over to you. You had the pleasure of, as we've mentioned, been at the Kuwaiti Reconstruction Conference, and you also, of course, have a long track record on Iraqi issues, so your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, for being here. Appreciate it, and thank you as well for being on the panel. I got to go to Kuwait, which is great. The last time I'd been there was 1990 during the Gulf War, so I got to take a second picture next to the two, what are they called? The two Spirit Towers. This time, what's that? There you go, the Liberation Towers. And it was good to be back, but more importantly, it was good to be able to see this international coalition come together, not only in the private sector and not only having 64 nations there, but also, like you said, Ambassador, seeing the Iraqis out front talking about the country, talking about not only economic opportunities in Iraq, but also about the humanitarian situation. One of the things that was the first day of the conference was great. The press was able to ask questions of not only Prime Minister Abadi, but also the Kuwaiti Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister, and also the Foreign Minister. The Iraqi press asked some of the toughest questions. Some people have warned, hey, don't go on a stage with Mike Pregent, he's going to ask tough questions. Well, the Iraqi press was tough. They were great, but their questions went unanswered. And a lot of their questions were based on reconstruction in the areas such as Mosul and Nineveh and Anbar province, and also the IDPs. Why won't we delay elections to allow IDPs to come back? Again, you mentioned 2.6 million are still in these camps and want to vote, and the majority of them are from Nineveh and Anbar province, Ramadi specifically, Fallujah, and Mosul. So the questions were great. So let's look at the visuals. Prime Minister Abadi had a great stage he looked, we use a term in the United States, he looked presidential. He looked in charge of a country, and he had the legitimacy of 64 countries backing him up by being there, and also the private sector companies. But there was also an air of, what are we getting ourselves into if we do these things? Not only from private sector investors and defense contractors that are very familiar with bakshish, a term in Arabic that means kickback. And I cited an example in 2008 when we were working with the Ministry of Energy to try to get a General Electric contract in Baghdad that would provide 24/7 electricity in Baghdad. But because GE didn't offer bakshish or kickback, it went to Siemens. And Siemens was only able to produce a third of that capacity. So these were things, and again, I said this in 2008, that's because it was after the surge. It was after Al-Qaeda was decimated. It was after we built the Sunni resistance in the Sahel and the awakening. It was after we allowed for political accommodation and reconciliation when we started focusing on what we're doing now, economic investment, capability, these important things when you have, that you do in post-conflict societies. But again, as we all know, security is tied to economy. This is an economy that's tied to its security, the Iraqi economy. This is something its neighbors know. This is something the United States knows based on our time there, our investment, our blood and treasure, sacrifice, not to mention the Iraqi sacrifice, of course. I was an embedded advisor with the Iraqi army and the Peshmerga, and we saw them fall all the time. And we were in armored vehicles and they were in pickup trucks, yet they were going in the same direction towards the enemy. And so there's a lot of cost in these things, and what we don't want to see is security backslide. And I think there was a hint of that at the conference. The good thing about the position of Baghdad is that a lot of the reconstruction, as you mentioned, is being outsourced to the UN and its NGOs and its other groups. I mean, I have the document that basically you cited everything that's going on in Iraq, where the UN is focused, of the 54 neighborhoods in Mosul, 16 are heavily damaged, 23 are moderately damaged, and 14 are lightly damaged. Again, this is not what the focus of this conference was when it came to the private sector investment in Iraq. This is where the UN was focused on. This is what UNAMI was focused on, and this is where the Iraqi press hit Baghdad hard. Said, where is the talk from the prime minister about these things? And of course you can find it. You can find those things, but it wasn't out front. I had a chance to listen to Samuel Askari talk about economic investment in Iraq. Al-Raji. Talk about economic investment in Iraq. And he talked about 4 main areas for economic investment. And he called Iraq's oil sector the breadbasket of the Iraqi economy. Then he talked about construction, telecommunications, and transportation. And again, this caution that was in the air at the conference was, well, how much influence does Iran have in Iraq? And again, that's the whole reason for this conference is to make the argument, just because Iran borders Iraq doesn't mean it should have more influence than Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or Turkey or other groups. Iraq shouldn't have to lean towards its eastern border. And this conference was about that. And if you looked at the focus of the investment from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, Kuwait's focus was on Basra, Qasr, these places, because it makes sense. It borders the area. That is a contentious area in the past, and this is a place to actually shore up economic investment. It also is a place to actually use leverage with not only Iran, but with Iraq when it comes to economic investment. And the Saudis, I was asked earlier, or I've been asked over the last couple of weeks about Saudi economic investment in Iraq and what does it mean? Is it a U.S. lever to curb Iranian influence in Iraq, or is it simply going to be what happened in Lebanon and Syria, where the Saudis invest, yet Iran still gets to do what they want? And those are the issues. We hosted a member of Al Hikmah Party. I had a great conversation, 2 hours of conversation. Again, also warned not to meet with this reporter or this observer of Iraq, but a great conversation. And he said something that resonated with me and ties directly to this conference in Kuwait. He said that the only way to counter Iran is if Iran is a strong economic power. And correction, Iraq is a strong economic power, and he's exactly right. And the best way for Iraq to be a strong economic power is to ensure that, much like what the IRGC does in Iran, they're not able to do in Iraq. The 4 main areas that the IRGC has its tentacles in the Iranian economy is oil sector, transportation, telecommunications, and construction. The 4 areas that Prime Minister Abadi and Sami al-Raji asked investors to go into were the oil sector, the telecommunications sector, the construction sector, and the transportation sector. So the United States, as we talk about blood and sacrifice, and we talk about the optimistic levers or the optimistic way forward by using our levers, is to actually help Iraq by maybe warning Iraq that investments that go into Iraqi companies that have any ties to an IRGC front company will be subject to U.S. Treasury sanctions. And that's a strong tool. It is also an insurance policy for investors, that when they go in, they'll be protected knowing that the companies they're doing business with have no ties to the IRGC. And I'll just leave that there because there's not a lot of evidence that there are ties to that now. They're just simply, if Iran's doing it in its economy, it's doing it in Syria's economy, and Lebanon's, and in Yemen's. It's been doing it in Iraq since 2003. Legitimate soft power, legitimate economic ties, but there's also questionable ones as well. So again, an insurance policy. Now, the one thing that Prime Minister Abadi said that was also a security blanket for investors, and also something that alleviates a lot of their concerns, is that he is going to look at getting rid of bakshish, getting rid of this kickback, this 10 to 20% kickback that secures a contract. And he is setting up a commission. and he wants to see it gain a lot of momentum after the elections. And that brings me to the elections, and I'll kind of try to wrap up here. The upcoming elections, again, 2.6 million Sunnis displaced because of the campaign against ISIS and what ISIS did, asked for a delay. The Iraqi press asked many questions about why isn't the election being delayed? And of course, you want to be able to say, we want to keep it on time. We want to do it the right way. The elections are important. When, Mr. Ambassador, when you mentioned cross-sectarian and cross-ethnic coalitions, we're seeing those, and they need to win. The issue now is the Fatah party. Is that the right party that I'm talking about? The one led by Hadi al-Amri? So currently, that party has the militias that you warned about. AH, Kitab Hezbollah, Badr Corps, participating in that party. And when we talked to Hikmah, they said, listen, we want to work to moderate. We want to work with other parties, coalition parties, in order to marginalize this party. Am I saying it right? All right, the Fatah party. The problem is now, if the Fatah party hasn't won yet, but it already has its minister in charge of the Ministry of Interior in Qasim al-Araji. It already has the commander and deputy commander of the Hashd al-Shabi in Hadi al-Amri and Abu Mehdi al-Muhandis. A designated U.S. terrorist who commands Kitab Hezbollah is the deputy commander of the Hashd al-Shabi. Again, Sistani volunteers are great Iraqis that did all the right things. The problem is they started falling under this command and control structure. We can talk about that later. But the issue is, if Fatah wins, these ministers stay in place. If they lose, do the other parties have enough power to push them out and get somebody that could send a signal not only to investors, not only to Americans and NATO, because NATO's actually voiced concern. Before we go in, we want to make sure Fatah party doesn't win. We want to make sure Hadi al-Amri is not the prime minister. Those are important things. But in the forming of these coalitions during this election, in order to make the economic investment opportunity more stable, the security situation more stable, these coalitions aren't talking about replacing these ministers or getting rid of Muhandis as the deputy commander. And again, one of our biggest problems is the U.S. training and equip program. Again, 10 U.S. tanks fall in the hands of Kitab Hezbollah through the U.S. training and equip program, through the MOD and MOI. U.S. government denied that for the last 2 years, and now there's evidence of it, and we're trying to get it back. These aren't captured ISIS tanks. These are MOD OPCON tanks to IRGC Quds Force militias. I just want to hear some of the political parties in Iraq talking about how they're going to stop the influence and the saturation of IRGC Quds Force proxies like Badr Corps, Sabal Haq, and Kitab Hezbollah when they have such prominent positions in the Iraqi government today. And that is causing concerns not only for the NATO training program in Iraq, and not only are they warnings and indicators of security backslide in Iraq, they just cement that argument that Iran has more influence in Iraq than it should. And just a quick anecdote. 27 Hashd al-Shabi IRGC Quds Force militia members were killed south of Kirkuk, north of Baghdad, vicinity of Hawija. And this is terrible, but it was cheered by some sectors of the Iraqi population, the Sunni Arab population of Nineveh, and some in the Sunni Kurdish population of the KRG-controlled areas. In that, ISIS killed IRGC Quds Force militias, and the IRGC Quds Force militias deserved it. And that right there, especially with this operation taking place in an area where there's oil, there's infrastructure, and there are still ISIS pockets, is concerning not only to investors, not only to NATO allies, but also to those of us, like you point out in your article, that want to ensure that this victory is permanent and not simply a reset of conditions that led to ISIS to begin with an increased dynamic in that now the U.S. is no longer trusted as much by the Kurds and by the Sunnis, but also that Iran has more influence than it's ever had. And I'm happy to be wrong about all of that. I just want to be comfortable in saying I was wrong.
Thanks, Mike. I actually wanted to also tease you up before I open it up on the U.S. administration's sort of new approach to Iraq, particularly on burden sharing, which Linda also mentioned in her comments, and I did at the outset of still being the largest humanitarian and stabilization donor, but not contributing to reconstruction. On the security side, looking more whether a NATO mission could be part of ways of perhaps stepping down sort of U.S. engagement. How do you see all that combined with this?
Well, what the administration says publicly can actually hurt what we're doing privately in Iraq. When I say privately, in meetings where we're assuring guarantees and making promises to the Iraqi security forces we're working with, that we're training with, and also as we try to reestablish these levers that we've had in the past with Baghdad. My concern about the current administration's strategy is that in the State Department, Iraq has fallen almost completely out of the Iranian influence talk. State Department has said Iran's influence in Syria and Lebanon and Yemen, and left Iraq out. And that's concerning to generals like General Votel at CENTCOM, to generals in the Department of Defense. The other part of that is also the president's strategy to defeat ISIS, call it a victory, and get out. Outsource reconstruction to Iraq, maintain a minimal presence. Again, these Iraqi political parties are calling for the exit of American forces. And now there's a U.S. policy where Hashid al-Shabi militias cannot be within 20 kilometers of American bases, or where Americans are training Iraqis. The problem is the Hashid al-Shabi militias that they're most concerned about, the RGC Quds Force ones, brag that they can wear any uniform within the Iraqi military. And that's concerning to our 4,000 trainers there and special operators and advisors, that the force they're training could easily be infiltrated or infiltrated by an anti-U.S. militia-directed killer or assassin, a green-on-blue incident, so to speak. And that's concerning. I want to believe that this administration doesn't want to go back to Iraq again. But by saying, don't give me my own war, you get one. Meaning President Trump doesn't want his own war in Iraq, well, you get one. Obama didn't want one and he got one. I don't want 10-year-old Americans to be in Iraq when they're 20, fighting Al-Qaeda 2.0 or 3.0 and ISIS 7.0. And also being told you can't come in because it's a situation like Syria where the U.S. is uninvited, even though this is an existential threat to the United States and to the U.S., these terrorist organizations that keep popping up in these ungoverned spaces in the Middle East and North Africa and Southwest Asia. So the administration, again, I'd listen to the generals, like you mentioned earlier, listen to the generals and then challenge the generals to come up with solutions. And again, nobody wants to stay in Iraq, but we've stayed in Iraq this whole time. So maybe we should stay in some capacity, some normalized treaty where there is a U.S. base there that can do exactly these things when something like this pops up, augment the Iraqi security forces, provide capabilities and intelligence, and be able to decimate something that shouldn't have been born to begin with.
Thanks, Mike. Let me now ask a question to sort of the whole panel, and you're also allowed to sort of comment on each other's intervention if you want to. So one really sort of simple, but probably hopefully a little bit difficult question would just be, what in all this do you then see as sort of the greatest challenge for Iraq moving forward among all the things that we've sort of outlined up here at the panel? And I'll start with you, Ambassador.
Well, the biggest challenge that Iraq is facing actually is the fact that it has to address issues with tools that need building. So, for example, one of our difficulties in the last 10 years of wars that we've had is that we were at the same time engaged in a war, but we were building our army at the same time. Okay, and in order for us to address many of the issues that you raised, corruption, better services to citizens, equity, we need to strengthen our institutions. So I think the greatest guarantor of Iraqi independence is not only that we will be a strong economy. I mean, we have oil, we have resources, we can do that. But I think the strongest guarantor of our being an independent nation that can stand and look any other country in the eye is if we can strengthen our institutions. And this is actually something that we are on track. And having been engaged in an Iraqi institution for the last 14 years, I can tell you that I see incremental changes that are cumulatively making it better. I'll give you a simple example. Early on, when we were staffing the foreign ministry, we had promotion exams. Everybody used to pass, okay? Now, people flunk. There are standards being applied, okay? One of the reasons why the ICTS is such a successful institution in Iraq is that because it applies criteria and principles that make it a strong institution. So this is the track that we're on. Fighting corruption is part of it. Now, recently I was in Baghdad for an ambassador's conference, and we the focus of this conference this year was Reconstruction. Last year's was liberation, if you will. But just as our army is a much better institution than it was a few years ago, right now we're focusing on the institutions that we need to build up to fight the battles that we need to fight, particularly with regard to corruption. And so now the institution that is the most in the limelight is our Integrity Commission, which is actually making good progress.
Thanks. Linda, over to you.
Thank you. And I would add to the wise comments of the ambassador. I wrote a 2008 book about the surge period called Tell Me How This Ends. And chapter 15 has a list of things that were widely agreed to be the critical issues to bring stability to Iraq. And that list is more or less still to be done. So I think it's very important for things like the full implementation of the federalized system. There's a decentralization law on the books. The implementation has begun to devolve the 8 ministries down to the provinces or governorates, but it absolutely needs to be done to give that sense of local ownership to the population. The debathification law needs to be revised, the status of Kirkuk, the hydrocarbons law, et cetera. Those of you who follow Iraq know the list very well. And I think it will be incumbent upon the Council of Representatives, because it is a parliamentary system, to grasp this nettle and understand that these questions have legal and institutional answers, and to commit to building and legislating those answers. Iraq is a wealthy country. There is no reason why it can't come through this dark period, but it must find the political will to do so. And I think that I firmly believe that Iraqis have no wish to be the 51st state of Iran. They are sufficiently confident now that they can move forward and set the appropriate limits on Iranian influence. The worst thing would be for the U.S. to publicly demand or legislate X, Y, or Z conditions, because that will ensure the inflammation of Iraqi nationalism and elect the very man, Michael, you would like to see not elected. So let us work in a sophisticated way, use the Strategic Framework Agreement to put in, I think very fairly, demand transparency conditions, as the World Bank does for any further aid. Hopefully we will lock in a long-term security assistance agreement. They want it. It's our core competence. We have an advantage here over Iran, and let's press that. So that's a mouthful, but that's what I would say we have to do going forward.
Thanks, Linda. One of the words we often also bandy around up here on the panel would be reconciliation. And I wondered, with all your practical experience, for you to also to tease that out.
Thank you.
On how do we actually do that in practice? What does it mean when you say people
Yes.
have to reconcile after something as disastrous as ISIS?
And I left that out, and I apologize, because I mentioned the decentralization law, but there's also this idea of bottom-up reconciliation or social cohesion, which is the term of art being used by a lot of people. And I think it's very important that these grassroots efforts be undertaken to resolve some of the conflicts in the communities at that level. Also, you have to deal with the fact that many children have been indoctrinated. There's a severe PTSD problem. People have really been traumatized by life under the brutal ISIS regime. And so I think the bottom-up area is critical to attend to. The parties will need to tackle the national, they don't like to use the word even reconciliation, some of them. They call it national settlement. There are this menu of issues, as I mentioned, that have to be dealt with, and I think the parliament is the venue, but UNAMI is still there, the UN Assistance Mission. That's one of their main mandates, in addition to addressing the holding of elections in a fair and free way. And I should just say, this is a critical benchmark to make sure all those 2.6 million people get registered and are able to vote. So I think it's fine for the elections who've gone ahead, but it is incumbent upon IHEC and the Iraqi government to make sure everyone can, in fact, vote.
Before you give the floor to Michael, just a couple of points I wanted to make that bear on elections, and I should have spoken about that. You know, people tend to forget that under the circumstances, what Iraq has achieved is quite remarkable. In the last, 14 years, and it might seem trite for under normal circumstances, but school exams took place on time throughout the country, including recently with displaced populations. It's not a small thing, except under ISIS, of course. And one of the reasons, actually, the Iraqi government was really intent on liberating Mosul is because the first year Mosul was occupied, the curricula used in the schools remained the Iraqi curriculum. The second year, ISIS developed its own curriculum. And as you can imagine what it's like, and it would not have been wise to let them continue to brainwash our youth with it. Okay, so and the same kind of spirit actually will allow us to hold the elections on time. I think just as we were able to hold exams on time, which require registration of students and a follow-up and ensuring an integrity of a process, elections are the same thing. I think we'll follow through. And one thing that will help us achieve these elections and in a way that will be respected and recognized is to have international observers, and so local observers as well. And so one of the things I'm actually trying to argue for is to increase the number of support we have to bring in international observers, local observers, to make sure that these elections are as transparent and true and fair. And in the end, the person who will be Iraq's next prime minister will be decided for by the Iraqi elector.
That's a great.
Whoever that might be, and I have to tell you, these are real elections. I wouldn't bet on it. I wouldn't bet on it. I have my preferences, of course, as an Iraqi would, and my compatriots here probably also have their own preferences, but these are real elections.
Thanks, Ambassador. Mike, over to you both on the greatest challenge, but maybe also on like how we really sort of secure this time around that there isn't a resurgence of ISIS, which is sort of, or terrorist organization 3.0, as you said, which has been sort of a U.S. priority for a long time.
So ISIS, we caveated in the paper, ISIS has been military defeated, and if we were to dig down a little bit more into the nuance, we would say that ISIS has lost territory, the ability to plant a black flag, but still operates in the Al-Qaeda model based on what they're able to do. They still are a threat. They still target the Iraqi security forces. They are still able to conduct suicide bombings in Baghdad. We've had 2 bombings in the last 10 days, and then we had the 27 Hashid al-Shabi killed by ISIS fighters. Again, ISIS has seen Iraq and Syria as one continuous piece of land, piece of territory, where the United States policy stops at the border. We have a policy in Iraq that stops at the border of Syria, and we have 2 policies in Syria that stop east and west of the Euphrates, but we'll get into that later, or not at all, actually. So the challenge is, how do we keep ISIS from coming back? Again, this feels like 2011 all over again. And the one area I would defend President Obama on, a lot of people say that because President Obama left Iraq, this happened. This was already happening before we left in 2011. The Iraqi security forces had already been politicized by Prime Minister Maliki. I served in the 2nd Iraqi Army Division, and there wasn't a single Iraqi Army Division commander left in 2011 that we had worked with. They had been politicized. They were from areas, the majority Shia areas of Iraq. And as the federal police gets replaced in Mosul on the west side and the Iraqi army comes in, it's important to note that it's the 15th and 16th Iraqi Army Divisions that were recruited from Basra and Sadr City and not from Nineveh. And this question of retraining an Iraqi security force was one of the reasons we didn't stand up a brand new 2nd Iraqi Army Division, 3rd Iraqi Army Division, and 4th Iraqi Army Division when they fell after they were politicized by the Maliki government. That call could have easily been made. We didn't have to retrain we didn't have to train an army and put them in. We simply had to do a call for action. Say, hey, the 30,000 Sunnis and Kurds and Shia that were kicked out of the Iraqi military by Maliki because you didn't serve a political party or a political agenda, show up at Taji Air Base and let's replenish the ranks of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. It would have been better to go into Kirkuk with the 4th Iraqi Army Division that knows the area. It would be better to go into Mosul with the 2nd Iraqi Army Division that knows the area. It would have been better to go into Tal Afar with the 3rd Iraqi Army Division that, again, is comprised of local military members that know the neighborhoods, know the streets, know the tribal sheikhs. The Iraqi security forces, I would have to say, one of the most important things here is there are no more Peshmerga units in the Iraqi army with the exception of 1 brigade from the PUK side of the house that is just south of Dahuk, or just south of Erbil, actually. It is a predominantly Shia force. That doesn't mean they're sectarian. And I understand that the country is 60% Shia, but at a certain point it's not. And as you move into northern Iraq, it should start to reflect who lives in Nineveh, who lives in Kirkuk province, who lives in northern Salahuddin and Diyala and Anbar, of course. And Sunnis need, in 2007 and 2008, they were crying for political accommodation and reconciliation. Again, a term that Mohammed Salman said didn't exist in Arabic, but it existed in the Iraqi Follow-up Committee for National Reconciliation, something that we engaged with on a daily basis to ensure reconciliation was a part of the political space that the surge had offered. And it seems that we're there now. Mohammed Salman was at the conference and he talked about reconciliation, and he's the right guy to talk about it. It's, again, when you say the right things and they're heard, just like with US politics, what happens afterwards? There are actually policies that go into effect that change things. I'm concerned about security backslide. I was in Mosul after the operation. I had more trouble getting through Asaish checkpoints in the KRG areas than I did getting into Mosul. Once I got into Mosul, our car wasn't stopped at all. And there was a minimal military presence on the east side. And there were a lot of military-age males on the east side. Basically, you couldn't tell ISIS had been there. There were people everywhere. I'm concerned it's ripe for security backslide. And that's one of the biggest issues. And I think there should be a call by a lot of the political parties as part of their platform for these upcoming elections to say that, hey, we need to rebuild these Iraqi army divisions that used to be responsible for Anbar, Nineveh, and Kirkuk province, and bring back in a force. It doesn't matter if they're Sunni or Kurdish. It shouldn't matter, right? All that should matter is that they're Iraqi. But we're not seeing Kurdish Iraqis in the Iraqi security forces, with the exception of individuals like Bawari in the CTS and other Kurds in different places. But I think Iraqis need to see that. At least when I go to Iraq, I try not to talk to Americans, and I try not to talk to politicians. I try to talk to Iraqis. And I talk to Iraqis from Ramadi, Fallujah, Mosul. I talk to politicians from Baghdad, either from the Alawi side or for someone else. I've been asking to go into Baghdad and talk to the other sides to get my mind changed. And I'd like to be invited in to talk to them so that I can be an advocate for this one Iraq narrative that's going around, and this secure environment that Iraq is now in,
An
because
election coming up
ISIS.
that needs observers. So
It needs observers. I'd love to observe.
Actually, we have a research center at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that would welcome you as a speaker.
I would love to show up.
That's great. There are lots of more questions I would love to ask at this panel. You can see the spectrum of views, but I also know that I can see there are people out in the audience that are really itching also to get their questions in. So I would now open it up for questions and show your hands, and we have a microphone that will come around. So we'll start with this gentleman here. And please introduce yourself and try to state a relatively short question, not a sort of long
Peter
commentary.
Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. I'm wondering if any of the, what might be the Iranian external aid entities are contributing in any way to reconstruction in Iraq. For example, maybe the Bonyads are reconstructing Shia mosques, maybe even civil engineering projects. Is there anything going on what we might call the foreign aid account from Iran?
Thank. Let's grab a couple of questions. So let's down here in the corner. That one over there. Yeah, you got it. Yeah.
Voice of America Turkish service. Turkey was one of the biggest contributors in Kuwait.
True.
Mr. Ambassador, what does it mean to you? And can we say a new page is opening between two countries?
Thanks. And then let's grab a third one down here. Front here.
Yeah, Mark Kimmett, I do private business in Iraq. Mike, let's fast forward for about 9 months. A new government has been formed. It is led by Hadi al-Amri.
Right.
What should the U.S. policy be at that point?
Well,
Let's let the other people answer the first question.
Okay. Yeah. So I have Turkey, which I think would be the ambassador, their new role a large role in reconstruction, and the question of Iran and organizations that actually provide, maybe Linda and the ambassador, and then Mike, you on the third question.
sure.
Well, on Turkey, it's a really interesting comparison between Turkey and Iran. Early on, the Turks were very reluctant to get involved politically in Iraq, but they were pushed into Iraq by their private sector, which did extremely well. We have, billions of dollars in commercial exchanges with Turkey, and in fact, this pledge will only serve to enhance that. I mentioned the ambassadors' conference I attended. We were lodged at the Prime Minister's guest house, which was built, in fact, by a Turkish company. On Iranian involvement in the reconstruction effort of Iraq, I know many Iranian companies have actually bid on several major projects. One I was familiar with was the Mansouriya power plant, which they competed with a French company. Eventually, the French company did win, but they also have bid on a number of schools, and I'm sure that they are very much involved in the rebuilding and redevelopment of Najaf and Karbala. And Iran is actually a major source of revenue to Iraq, if only because of the religious tourism that Iraqi cities are Greece to receive many millions of Iranian pilgrims.
And that's aid.
That's not aid. That's actually commerce, trade. On aid, I don't think that the Iranians did pledge anything at the conference in Kuwait.
Linda, over to you.
Yes, and I think that is the formal answer to your exact question regarding Iranian aid pledges. But of course, as you probably well know, they've been involved in many areas in this model of kind of militias, the Hezbollah model of offering social services and so forth. They work through, though, a lot of locals. I mean, obviously, Qasem Soleimani's been visible out in the battlefield, but I think that it's very interesting to watch how they have, I think, very effectively used their ties into the popular mobilization forces to conduct a variety of what you might call influence operations, and very agile also in reaching out in the Sunni areas to recruit Sunni population. So I guess if you widen the aperture a bit, there's a whole spectrum of Iranian engagement in Iraq that runs the gamut of the diplomatic, military, economic, and informational space.
If I may add, that's the way things should be. We have, God knows how many, over 1,000 kilometers of common borders, historic ties,
And by saying that, I'm not labeling that all as nefarious. I don't want to, I think that it's very important to understand that Iran has a natural level of influence and engagement that, whether we like it or not, is going to occur. And I'll just cite Ryan Crocker, who is one of my great teachers on the matter of Iraq. It's just a fact of life, and there is the religious tourism. There's a lot, but there's also the legacy of a bitter war. There's the Arab-Persian divide. I mean, we need to be a little more sophisticated about our understanding of the Iran-Iraq relationship. And, historically, the U.S. role in the region has either inflamed or made use of that kind of tension and the counterweight issue. My only real advocacy is that the U.S. not turn its back, walk away from Iraq, and cede the playing field entirely to Iran. That would not serve U.S. national security interests, and we're frankly very much in danger of that as we turn our attention to other challenges around the world.
Mike, there was a direct question to you, and then, of course, chime in on some of the other issues.
And the interesting about your last comment is that's exactly what Al-Fatah party is asking for, is for the U.S. to get out, not to turn its back, but to exit. And then that's an issue. So let's go back to your question, General. So 9 months from now, a body wins. I would just say,
I'm
sorry. I thought you said a body wins. You're saying Amir wins in that question?
Yeah.
All right, well, let me just talk about what Iran's been able to do under Haider al-Abadi. They've been able to do whatever they've wanted to under Haider al-Abadi over the last 4 months or 4 years. So if Hadi al-Amiri wins, we'll have roundtables like this where we'll say he's not as bad as Qais Khazali. He's not as bad as Abu Mehdi al-Muhandis. And we've worked with him before. General Barbero was an advisor to Hadi al-Amiri. I sat next to General Barbero when he was talking to him and said, hey, he's a commander of Bata Corps. And General Barbero said, no, he's not. General Barbero now says, yes, he is. So if Hadi al-Amiri wins, it's actually bad for Iran in that NATO is warning about a Hadi al-Amiri victory. NATO's not concerned about having a train and equip program that is under the premiership of Iran's premier proxy in Iraq, the Bata Corps. So if Iran was smart, you'd want Haider al-Abadi to win, because again, Iran has been able to do everything it has wanted to over the last 4 years and will continue to do so with the blessing of the United States State Department and Department of Defense, as we continue to obfuscate what you and I talked about over the last year, is whether or not IRGC Quds forces have hijacked the U.S. training equip program, where DOD said no, Department of State said no, and now they're saying, yes, in fact, they have, and we want to get those tanks back. It's not only the tanks, it's the selection of who is trained on the tanks. It's the selection of who's trained to fly American F-16s. Now, it's important during 2005 and 2006, when Qasem Soleimani was conducting an assassination campaign in Iraq, is that he targeted Iraqi pilots, regardless of their sect. Shia, Sunni, and Christian pilots were assassinated by IRGC proxies. They do not want to ever see Iraq be a threat to Iran. The best way to do that is to be able to influence what happens in the MOD and the MOI. Again, if Amiri wins, bad for Iran, because hopefully we'll see what it is. But there will also be a concerted effort by people that will say that Hadi al-Amri is not that bad because he's not Qais Khazali. I argue that he is that bad because he's acceptable to us, and he also answers directly to Iran. And then, of course, that I expect to be balanced, or I'm sorry, countered.
You want a quick follow-up? Or the ambassador?
Yeah, I just,
Oh, yeah, wait for the mic, yeah, because otherwise we also have to...
Can you delay the mic for about 5 minutes? Okay, go ahead.
Again, let me just restate, forget
Right.
about the name.
Right.
If there is a prime minister who leans more towards Iran than towards the coalition/United States, what should the U.S. policy be?
Okay. The U.S. policy should be at that time, and we've made this a policy recommendation, to move the U.S. Train and Equip program to Erbil, to move the U.S. JSOC footprint to Erbil, to establish a Sunni Kurdish and Sunni Arab security force that keeps ISIS from coming back to Sunni areas, and also stops the northern land bridge that Iran is trying to establish in Iraq. That would be the military security policy recommendation, and that would actually give you leverage over Baghdad over time. Again, if you want to use levers of U.S. Treasury, secondary sanctions, be able to do certain things, you'd be able to do that. Iran should rest assured that we're not going to do any of that. We're not going to do any of that. We will promote the next prime minister, regardless of whether it's Hadi al-Amri or Abadi, as a pro-U.S. bulwark against Iran. Yet when you look at the actual makeup of the Iraqi security forces, you won't find it. When you look at the existence of the Hashd al-Shabi, not the Sistani volunteers, but the ones that actually control the PMU budget, Abu Mehdi al-Mohandes and Hadi al-Amri and Qasem al-Araji, you will have a friend in the United States Defense Department and DOS that'll say it's not happening.
Thanks, Mike.
Sorry
I'll
to
have the ambassador come
look,
in now, and then I'll just let others that want for the last round of questions, then I note your fingers. So ambassador first.
I have to say what I have to say is that, you know, the next prime minister of Iraq will be chosen by the Iraqi electorate, and people will have to deal with it, no matter what.
That's
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly it.
Yeah.
as you know, as this country proves, you can't predict that too well.
Sure. That's a good point here.
May I just also add what I believe the ambassador should also say is that any placement of U.S. forces in the territory of Iraq will be determined by Baghdad and not Erbil.
Well, that goes without saying. Yeah. And Washington adheres to that. I think.
Question over here.
Thank you very much, Alexander Kravitz, and thank you for the panel and the very wise comments as Linda described them. I'd like to ask two questions. One is I wonder if the ambassador could comment on the Baghdad-Erbil, current dialogue, shall we say. There's been some talk about the opening of the airports. There's also been some talk that Baghdad might move on the Hurmala field. So I wonder if he might give us some insights into that. And then I'd like to ask about the elections, because obviously all the investment and everything is going to be contingent. Everything is going to wait until the results of the election. And I wonder if, again, maybe perhaps the ambassador could give us some, walk us through, if you will, on how the 2.6 million IDPs are being registered, and perhaps more important, how are they going to be able to vote? How is it going to work? I mean, if you're an Ambari refugee IDP in the Kurdistan region, how are you actually going to be able to to vote for your representatives?
Thanks. That was two questions. Over here now.
Thank you.
And a last one in the end. I'm only going to take 3. Sorry for the rest of you who had, and please, a short question.
This one's for Michael. You alluded to earlier, my name is Fred Bonin from the Daily Ripple. I'm also a Gold Star dad with 3 other kids serving. And you alluded that when we left Iraq, did it not cause the Iraqi people to then take responsibility for their own heavy lift and in the end turn out to be the thing that most united them? And would it be the same if we were still there through that whole time period doing the heavy lifting?
Good question. And then down here in the back, all the way in the back. And that's our last question.
Yes, Stephen Rasha from the Catholic Church in Iraq. And this question is to Mr. Ambassador. Could you speak just briefly in the time we have about the importance of cultural pluralism and especially as it affects religious minorities to the social reconstruction as opposed to just the physical infrastructure? It's a topic we've spoken on before, but for the record, if you could speak regarding the Iraqi government's view on that. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, I'll let you start, so both be the answer to the questions and any sort of final remarks that you would want to make, because then we will round up around the panel.
On the minorities, the official view of the Iraqi government is Iraq is not Iraq without its minorities. And to me personally, I think the status and the position of the minorities going forward is going to be one of the signatures of how well we've succeeded. Actually, this afternoon, I'm meeting with Senator Brownback, who is going to Iraq to follow up on this issue. There's nothing I can say to stress the importance of this issue to Iraq. And the good thing that I can tell you is that we have a strong diaspora in which these minorities are very present, and they are engaged in the reconstruction of Iraq. Recently, during one of the reconstruction conferences in Washington, Mustafa al-Hiti, who is in charge of reconstruction of the liberated areas in Iraq, received 2 people who represented Chaldean businessmen from Detroit who were really interested in rebuilding their ancestral villages and churches. So, this is important to us. I think if you go through the roster of electoral lists, you'll find the Iraqi minorities are very, very present. The local electoral laws, I think, will guarantee them at least 5 seats. I can't say it better than saying that Iraq is not Iraq without its minorities.
On the registration of IDPs and voting, if
the good thing, is that the IDPs aren't really all scattered. They're in localized places in camps with presence of international organizations. So registration can take place. I know for a fact that the Iraqi electoral system is trying to develop an advanced, decentralized IT system for registration, which should be able to incorporate people in different areas, not in their homes, in Kurdistan or other places.
Right.
There's actually one point that I wanted to address, which is the relationships between Baghdad and Erbil.
Yeah, that was the other.
I'm not, because the details of discussions evolve, but I can tell you that I recently was present when Prime Minister Abadi met with Prime Minister Van Barzani, and the meetings they had were extremely cordial. There's an ongoing process, and I am hopeful that all of the issues that need to be resolved will be resolved.
Great.
I'll give the ambassador the balance of my time. The question about 2011, when we left, what happened?
The Arab
Basically
Spring,
your question.
Syria happened.
Syria happened.
Syria happened.
And they looked over their left shoulder and said, if we can do that here, we can do that in Iraq, and moved in. And we just got to keep that from happening again collectively. And all I would say is we look through this sophisticated lens at Iraq, we shouldn't be shocked when we see facts, warnings, and indicators of security backslide and Iranian influence.
Thanks, Mike. Linda, your last remarks?
Yes, I will just add to this common theme. I
Right.
think there's also always been a majority Iraqi membership of the ISIS animal, so it isn't just a Syria beast, and attending to the grievances of the people that have been left out, I think, is the burden for the Iraqi government. And I think that there's, with regard to the Hadi al-Amri discussion, it's very important, I think, to note there was quite a backlash on social media and so forth at that very brief alliance that was announced. And one of the analysts, Iraqis,
Between Abadi and Atta
that's
Party.
right. And one of the Iraqi analysts said to me, you know, people are very grateful for the role that the PMF played, but they don't necessarily want that to be their government. So I think holding free and fair elections is going to produce a result that might surprise some of the skeptics, but nonetheless, Iraq merits continued attention as my main message.
Thanks, Linda. And actually, the ambassador had one last message.
On the relationship between Iraq and the United States, you know, listening to us, one might conclude that our relationship ideally would be nothing but military security. Nothing could be farther from the truth. As an anecdote, the day the travel ban was announced in early last year, the Iraqi Foreign Ministry had convened all the members of the committees that would be involved in the strategic framework agreement with the United States. What we would like to see is an evolution of our relationship from something that is essentially military to something that is way more than that. I graduated from a high school that was founded by American Jesuits. My uncle is a graduate of the University of Michigan. We would like to see more of this kind of involvement in Iraq. One of the biggest successes that I can count in Iraq is the American University in Sulaymaniyah. And I can tell you that there are discussions now in Baghdad to set up an American university in Baghdad. This is the kind of relationship that we're eager to see. We're also eager to see your Fortune 500 companies to come and put shop and help us rebuild our country, because at least we'll be insured to be implementing best practice.
60% of the population is under the age of 25, so it's right for that kind of relationship.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a great way to end our panel discussion today on Reconstructing Iraq. It happens every day now in Iraq that this work takes forward, and as you can see here, we had a great debate on it. I enjoyed being up here with our panelists that had a lot of knowledge and expertise on this, and you all had a lot of questions. I know there are more that wanted to ask something, but we have to bring it to a close, and I want you all to end by thanking our panelists together here.